It's great to be here and to have the chance to talk to you about this important topic. I should say a few things first. That I'm an academic who works with polls. I run a project called the Barometer, and so we do public opinion surveys. A bit about our project in 15 countries across the Arab world. So we've interviewed. We generally have it's kind of like the Cox's Barometer in a sense. We have a couple of very general topics that we ask about. And this is the majority of our surveys. We survey every couple of years, and then we also add one or two new batteries that generally target something of interest to us or to the current changes in the region. For instance, in the last wave, we talked a lot about the Islamic State and support for that. And then we also include some items that are of issue to funders. So in a sense, we're doing polls not specifically for policy, but really for understanding a region from abroad. So. In total, we've done 4 waves now across the last 10 years, and I'm going to talk some about how we've derived insights from this and how this can be used for policy, and come up with some suggestions for how, when formulating polls, we've at least found it useful to generate information for policymakers and those interested in policy. So just, again, this is coming from me. My background as an academic and also someone engaged in international survey research. We're not specifically trying to influence Jordanian policies, for instance, or policies in other countries. This isn't really our goal. Really, we're trying to provide information about how people in these countries think, and particularly how they think relative to one another. So how do Jordanians versus Algerians view institutions, things of that nature? And so in that point, it's not our goal to change policies. It's not our goal to necessarily inform a specific party, but really just to provide information to the individuals who are involved. So part of this comes from determining our audience, that we really face a number of different audiences. So at one level, there are policy makers, there's politicians. We also have the domestic actors in the countries that we're working in. We also have foreign policy experts in Washington, particularly in Europe, who also look to our surveys, as well as NGOs and international organizations. So we have a variety of audiences that we all try and develop polls that have some meaning to these different groups and that they can use for their various purposes. So it's very broad polls in that sense. But also we face another challenge, which is not something that is necessarily faced by a lot of the people who've been talking so far, which is the democratic versus authoritarian nature. That a lot of times are doing one of the few polls in authoritarian countries that really gives people an equal say, that elections aren't free and fair here, that there's not other ways to influence policy. So it is an important role that we think about as we work forward, as we go forward. But also we have this experts versus public role, which is that a lot of times the experts at least pretend not to pay any attention to what we say or discount it in a lot of the countries. And I'm not sure that's entirely true, but certainly the public seem to take this more seriously when we get the information out in the countries where we work. So again, there's a lot of different audiences and the different ways that we attempt to influence policy. And so I'm going to talk through a few of the ways that we seek to do this. So, we have a couple of advantages. One is that few scientific polls are conducted in most of the countries that we work. That's not true necessarily in all of them. In some, Tunisia, and others, there's a number. But often we're one of the few organizations that actually does surveys that are available to be examined, that become public, the data. And so, we have an advantage that we have a lot to discover, that there's not necessarily a saturation of polls in these societies. However, we face some challenges. One is, who cares about some of these countries? We once published a poll on we published an analysis of Algerian presidential elections when everyone knew the outcome, and we were told by the Washington Post Monkey Cage blog we had one of the lowest ever hit rates, for that blog. So, I think 2,000 people ended up caring enough to read the article. So, at one level, who cares? The other is the unpredictability of policy interests. Again, we're a long-term project. We're not at a horse race. We're not looking, so much at one point in time. Each of our surveys represents that, but we're trying to get a perspective over time, particularly. And there was a little interest in our region before 9/11. Interest, was increased. It kind of waned. The Arab uprisings happened in 2011. So again, it changes hugely. So it's a challenge for us to really, kind of develop this in a longer-term perspective. But that really is our goal. So I'm going to talk through 5 lessons that we've learned, at least in how we've tried to affect policy. And so the first is to really create added value. value added. And that's something I don't think we've necessarily talked about as much here, but it is, something that Mary was suggesting, is that really there is a need to go beyond the polls, to actually provide some analysis and interpretation, and to think about what that means. Not everyone will agree with us. Some may think that we have our own biases. That's okay, but really it is trying to ground and interpret that so that, it isn't that the media can just take it and take it in a way that isn't necessarily accurate, that we really try and provide some type of value added. The second is to be innovative, and I'll talk about it more, that it's to do things like Mary was talking about, to ask questions in ways that aren't necessarily the traditional way, that we can get at different questions, and it allows us to do different types of, ask different questions. And the third is to really seek, in certain times, to make a direct contribution. I'll talk a bit about that, to ask things innovatively, but not necessarily, to hit major issues. And then the fourth is something that's come up before. I know it's going to be a subject of panel later, is ensure high quality data, which I think is something that can't be overestimated. And the fifth is to make the data public. And so I'll talk through some examples of each of these. The first is the value added, is to know what you do and know what you do well. And that what we really do is try and create, we create longer term, we do surveys that are not necessarily, about the exact instance, or not trying to measure things that can change week to week. We try to ask things that change over long periods of time, attitudes towards democracy, attitudes towards the government, and things that aren't necessarily subject to what happened this week. Now, again, as things happen in our surveys, we actually were in the field when the Arab uprisings happened. We saw some changes over that. And so it's not to say that, but it is just that we focus on things that are longer term. And so one of the things that we did was we tracked support for democracy using some kind of more general questions in Tunisia and Egypt after the uprisings. And so this became the basis of an analysis that was published in a policy journal, but also published in the Washington Post. And so it also helps to have for those of you who are fans of Ice-T, to have a title that's kind of catchy and refers back to something of that. But beyond that, it's, here's the views of democracy in Tunisia. And so you can see that right after the uprisings, there was, democracy seemed like it would be a panacea. But again, in Tunisia over time, this became a much more problematic view of a system, that as they experienced the challenges of democracy, or a democratic system, that they really became frustrated with it. The counter, which I haven't shown here in the graph, but which also appeared, was in Egypt, that people weren't necessarily frustrated with democracy, but they became very frustrated with the government itself, that they blamed the government for instance, overstepping its mandate, that the Muslim Brotherhood won very narrowly. And so the problem became with the Muslim Brotherhood, not so much with the democratic system. And so you saw two very different trajectories, and this could help explain to policymakers in Washington. This became something that was of interest to understand the different trajectories and how this played out. So a second thing we do is we try and ask innovative questions. And so we're academics. We're not necessarily interested in the horse race and this to the same extent. And so we try and develop unique products that can be of interest to policymakers based on our knowledge of academic literature. And so again, we ask direct and indirect measures. And so one example we have now is that sectarianism, or the kind of battle between different sects of Islam, is seen as dominating the Middle East right now, that's the common narrative that's being forwarded. So one of the things we did is we developed what's called a conjoint analysis, which is fairly common in some market research, but isn't so common in a lot of polls that are done. And so this is the end graph that we presented. And so there's a lot of data here that I won't walk through here, but one of the things we found is that Jordanians are actually more accepting of Shia refugees than they are of Sunni refugees coming across Syria, which is surprising because Jordan is predominantly Sunni. And so this kind of goes against the general findings. And so what we realize is that sect out of this is not a driving factor to the same extent as commonly believed. Ordinary citizens are actually more concerned about security threats, that if you're actually a Sunni refugee, you might be associated with the Islamic State, whereas a Shia refugee won't be. And so that there is another way to view the challenges that are taking place in this in this country. And so it's another way that at least policymakers, particularly foreign policymakers, but also the governments in Jordan and those who are seeking to combat the rise of sectarianism, can actually think about challenging the narrative. And so it creates a different type of messaging that really focusing on the common thread of, say, radical groups within Sunni Islam, such as the Islamic State, may actually be a unifying point for the different groups. Another thing that we've done is to address topical issues. And so, again, in this case, one of the things that's most topical in this wave is the Islamic State. Very clearly, the rise of it has been sudden and I think unexpected for a lot of people. And so one of the things we did was design an experiment, instead of asking necessarily direct questions, to really see what is it that leads people to support the Islamic State across the region? And we have, in this wave, 10 countries, so we can really look at the differences across countries, what may influence that. There's very few other polls or sets of projects that can do the same thing, and certainly none that are public. And so one of the things we did is we ended up out of this, we ran an experiment on it, and I'll not go into the details of that, but it ended up being, we published it in a number of different things, have done briefings on it in Washington, and also talked with people in different Arab capitals about the findings. And so really we were trying to figure out, what do ordinary citizens think about the Islamic State? Here you can see some of the variation across countries and support for it, which shows that generally it's fairly low, but there is variation, an important variation by country. But the other thing that we did is we asked about different frames. We provided people different frames for what would make them support the Islamic State. And here's one of the graphs that we can show, that we have a control group and we have a treatment with some of the violence that they've done. And also treatments that say that they oppose different groups to see, do any of these move public opinion in the favor of the Islamic State? And the bottom line is we find that really once the violence is brought up, no one, that people become less inclined to support the Islamic State. So what we, again, is we find relatively little support, that the narrative, we test some of the narratives that the Islamic State itself uses, and then we provide analysis of key groups. So in the graph I just showed, it was about young, uneducated men, which is one of the groups that is used to highly recruit for the Islamic State. And so this was heavily, there was great interest in Washington. And in fact, in the Washington Post Monkey Cage blog, which some of the people here at RRC have also published in, we actually, this last year, they released the results for the year, and we became the 6th most popular blog post in this forum, which we're actually kind of proud of, because all the other 9 were about the U.S. presidential election. So it showed that we could actually have some reach. But so it is another way to reach out. But again, one of the things, and to return to data quality, the survey results are only as good as the surveys themselves, and that many surveys are administered, but very few actually meet the rigorous data quality standards we insist upon. It's something that we've really tried to make our name on, that the Middle East has a lot of surveys that are not done particularly well. And so, you know, even in other places that this is a problem. So in Jordan, we were contacted by a major European organization that realized that they'd had a telephone sample of about 15% of the population that was sold to them as a national survey, you know, and that this wouldn't work for what they needed. And you know, again, in Europe, there was a major U.S. organization that was doing polls in Europe and realized that they had samples that didn't even come close to approximating a national sample. So this isn't just a problem in our region, it's a problem everywhere. And you know, a colleague and I published a paper that suggests that over 20% of publicly available surveys in non-OECD countries show some signs of fabrication. So this really is something that needs to be stamped out. And so again, you know, what we found is that we admit that we've had issues that come with data quality in the past, and that, you know, saying that and realizing that it doesn't come from being perfect, but being honest and saying what we can believe in the polls is really the key point. That, you know, saying that trying to do the best we can in these regions and being honest about what you can say and building that in terms of a reputation is what's really critical. And finally, I would also say make the data public, that we have only so much outreach we can do in terms of policy, but there's a lot of other people who have interest in these data. And so one of the uses of our data came out that surprised me was in Lancet, which is a major medical journal that was looking at how governance and health issues were related. And it's something I never would have thought to do, but certainly had real implications for policymakers in the region. And so this is another way to let other researchers do the work for you of trying to use it to influence policy. So in the end, you know, what we try and do is be strategic. Policymakers are often interested in the results we have, but they're not aware. We find that, you know, providing the value-added analysis is really something that's key, not just giving them the numbers, but giving them what the numbers mean, to disseminate in the press, to hold briefings and share the results, but also to take part in conferences and policy events. That this is really where people find the results and get interested in what we have. And so again, it's also being realistic. Our goal is not to directly influence policy. We just want to provide the tools that can be used to make decisions. You know, and not all policymakers value this type of evidence, as was referred to before. Alternative facts have become popular in the last 24 hours, so not all groups are necessarily equally likely to appreciate this. But you know, again, we want to provide the answers to questions, and we talk to policymakers and work with them in an attempt to try and use our talents to answer the questions that they need to provide credible information. So thank you very much.